The chandeliers of the Imperial Grand Ballroom glistened like frozen stars, casting a golden glow over the city's most influential leaders as they gathered for the annual corporate dinner. Every conversation hushed the moment Aiko Tanaka, the newly crowned billionaire CEO from Japan, entered the room with graceful poise. Dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown that shimmered under the light, she looked every bit the enigmatic powerhouse the media had described, yet there was a distance in her eyes, a guardedness that few could penetrate. She had stunned the business world months earlier when she acquired one of America's top tech firms, and now, this dinner was meant to be her first chance to connect with the company's stakeholders, politicians, and investors. When she rose to address the room, silence fell, forks froze mid-air and glasses lowered, everyone waiting to be impressed by the woman whose name had dominated the headlines. But as her clear, steady voice filled the hall, it was not English that flowed from her lips, it was Japanese. At first, the guests thought it might be a ceremonial greeting, but as her words carried on with rising passion and conviction, confusion began to ripple across the tables. Executives exchanged uneasy glances, some furrowing brows while others chuckled softly as though it were some sort of cultural display. Yet her hand gestures, her shifting tones, and the fire in her eyes made it obvious that what she was saying was far more than pleasantries, it was a message she desperately wanted them to hear. Unfortunately, the translation device on the podium had malfunctioned, leaving her heartfelt speech trapped in a language that nobody around her could understand. To the audience, it was a wall of elegant but indecipherable sounds, and to Aiko, it was the crushing realization that her truth, her vision, was evaporating into silence. She pressed on, refusing to break, her slender hands slicing the air with determination, but beneath her controlled exterior was a flicker of frustration, the sting of isolation pressing in on her. A billionaire she might be, but in that grand ballroom filled with polished suits and calculating smiles, she had never felt more alone. The room buzzed with low murmurs as Aiko's words poured into the void of misunderstanding, her speech echoing against walls lined with indifferent faces, each expression caught somewhere between confusion and impatience. Some investors leaned toward one another, whispering half-mock translations of their own, while others tapped on their phones under the table, pretending not to notice the woman who commanded the global stage just weeks ago but now seemed like a stranger in her own boardroom. Why wouldn't she prepare in English? One sharply dressed executive muttered under his breath, his tone dripping with arrogance, and a few others smirked in agreement. At the edge of the room, unnoticed in her black uniform with a silver tray balanced on her palm, Maya kept her eyes fixed on the billionaire. Unlike the rest, she wasn't confused, she understood every word that spilled from Aiko's lips. Years earlier, Maya had been an exchange student in Tokyo, working long hours at ramen shops and bookstores while she studied, absorbing the culture and mastering the language until it felt like a second skin. Now, standing in the shadows of the glittering ballroom, she listened as Aiko spoke not of profits or domination, but of honor, of bridging two worlds with fairness, and of creating an empire that uplifted people across borders rather than exploited them. The frustration in Aiko's tone was sharp, and Maya's heart clenched. She could feel the loneliness in her words because she knew what it was to stand in a crowd and not be heard. But she was just a waitress tonight, invisible in the hierarchy of wealth and power, and to speak out would be to risk ridicule or worse, losing the job she desperately needed. Her pulse quickened, the tray trembling slightly in her hand as she debated with herself, torn between duty and courage. The guests laughed now, misinterpreting Aiko's rising intensity as eccentric dramatics, their chuckles like knives against the sincerity of her speech. Maya's jaw tightened, she couldn't bear it any longer. She stepped closer to the center of the room, her lips parting as her heart pounded in her chest. The moment hovered between silence and thunder, and Maya knew that if she spoke, nothing in her life, or Aiko's, would ever be the same again. The hush that fell over the room was sudden and absolute when Maya's voice rang out, clear and deliberate, breaking the suffocating tension that had thickened around Aiko's speech. "She's not talking about money or control," Maya declared, her accent sharp yet graceful as she translated each line with unwavering confidence, her words slicing through the haze of confusion like light-piercing storm clouds. Heads turned in unison, the clinking of silverware halting midair as the wealthy elite stared in disbelief at the young black waitress standing before them, tray now abandoned on a nearby table. Maya's heart pounded in her ears, but she pressed on, channeling Aiko's passion with every sentence. She is speaking of respect, of opportunity shared across nations, of fairness between East and West, of a future built not by greed but by unity. Gasps fluttered around the room, the arrogance on the executives' faces melting into awe as Aiko paused mid-sentence, her sharp eyes widening in recognition and gratitude. For the first time that evening, the barrier between speaker and audience dissolved. Every gesture of Aiko's hand, every nuance of her voice now carried meaning, translated faithfully through Maya's steady voice. The billionaire's stoic mask softened into something more vulnerable, her lips curving into the faintest smile, a silent thank you directed at the woman who had stepped into the storm on her behalf. The once dismissive investors now leaned forward, captivated, some even nodding in agreement as Maya's translation breathed life into Aiko's vision. The energy in the hall shifted dramatically, what had been laughter and condescension transformed into thunderous applause that built and swelled, not just for Aiko, but for the unexpected waitress who had risen to give her words wings. Maya stood tall, her shoulders squared and her voice steady, no longer the invisible server in the shadows but the bridge that had made the powerful understand what they had almost lost. When she finished the last line, silence lingered for a heartbeat, then erupted into a standing ovation, the applause echoing like a tidal wave against marble walls. And in the center of it all, Aiko's eyes never left Maya's, two women from worlds apart, now bound by the simple power of language, truth, and courage. When the applause finally softened into murmurs of admiration, Aiko stepped gracefully down from the podium, her gown flowing like liquid silk as she moved through the throng of powerful men and women who now watched her with newfound respect. But her path was not toward the eager investors or the board members suddenly vying for her attention, it was toward Maya, who stood frozen with disbelief at the center of the ballroom, still clutching the empty tray she had dropped moments earlier. The billionaire CEO stopped before her, bowed slightly in a gesture of deep gratitude, and whispered in Japanese, "Anata ga in Akariba, watashi wa katakudata, without you, I was alone." The words washed over Maya, her throat tightening as she instinctively bowed back, replying softly in the same language, her voice trembling with emotion yet carrying the dignity of someone who finally felt seen. The elite guests, who had moments earlier dismissed her as a mere server, now regarded her with awe, their whispers rippling through the hall as if witnessing a story that would soon be told across boardrooms and media headlines alike. Aiko straightened, her expression unreadable but her eyes burning with intent, and asked for Maya's name before extending a hand, not in pity or formality, but in genuine partnership. "I need someone like you by my side," she said firmly, first in Japanese, then repeating it in English so everyone could hear. The word struck like a spark in the room, and Maya's hands trembled as she placed her palm in Aiko's, realizing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. In that moment, she was no longer invisible, no longer a shadow in the background of other people's greatness, she was stepping into a new world where her voice mattered. The two women, so different in origin yet united in resilience and vision, turned toward the future together as the ballroom erupted once more in applause, not just for wealth or power, but for the courage of connection that had redefined the night. And as Maya walked beside Aiko, leaving behind the tray and uniform that had once confined her, she knew her life had changed forever, the billionaire had found an ally, and the waitress had discovered her destiny.